Chapter 7 of Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sandra Cullum. Caroline the Illustrious, Volume 2, by William Henry Wilkins. Section 7. Chapter 7. The Queen and Literature. Queen Caroline is distinguished from the other queens consort of England as the one who took a genuine interest in literature. In this respect she surpassed all our queens regnant as well, though Elizabeth, and in a far lesser sense Anne, showed an appreciation of letters. The age of Elizabeth has been called the golden age of English literature, the reign of Anne the Augustan period. There can be no doubt as to the correctness of the first of these designations. The second is open to cavil. But though the English writers who flourished during the early part of the 18th century could not compare in loftiness or genius to the writers of the reign of Elizabeth, yet they formed a galaxy of talent amounting in some instances to positive genius, which England has never witnessed since. This galaxy shone throughout the reigns of Anne and George I, but soon after Caroline came to the throne, its brilliance began to wane. Some of the greatest writers were dead, and others had already given their best work to the world. It must be admitted that Queen Caroline's judgment in literature was not always as sound as her interest was genuine, in English literature at least. Her imperfect knowledge of the English language had something to do with this. One can hardly master the literature of a country if one does not begin to speak its language until middle life. In French and German literature she was far better equipped. She had read much and widely of them both, and of her favourite studies of metaphysics, philosophy, and theology, had perhaps taken in more than she could assimilate. Her correspondence with learned and scientific men kept her abreast of the best thought of the time, and no work of conspicuous merit made its appearance in Europe without Caroline's coming, directly or indirectly, in touch with its author. When Voltaire, for instance, visited England, he received ready help and generous appreciation at Caroline's hands. Voltaire came to England in 1726, after his quarrel with the Duc de Sully. Some months' detention in the Bastille, followed by an order to quit Paris, had driven him into exile. In the warmth of his welcome to England he found a balm for his wounded feelings, and he stayed in this country more than 2 years. He found in England many congenial spirits, and delighted in the freedom of discussion and latitude of opinion everywhere prevalent, from the court downwards, especially in the brilliant literary circle where he foregathered. He warmly admired the religious and civil liberty of England, and testified his admiration in his Lettres philosophiques, also called Lettres sur l'Anglais. He wrote in England his tragedy of Brutus, and here also he brought out in 1728 the first edition of his poem, La Henriade. To Caroline, who often received him at Leicester House as Princess of Wales, and who welcomed him with equal cordiality at court when she became queen, he dedicated this edition of La Henriade. The dedication in English ran as follows. To the Queen, Madam, it was the fate of Henry IV to be protected by an English queen. He was assisted by the great Elizabeth, who was in her age the glory of her sex. By whom can his memory be so well protected as by her who resembles so much Elizabeth in her personal virtues? Your Majesty will find in this book bold impartial truths, morality unstained with superstition, a spirit of liberty, Equally abhorrent of rebellion and of tyranny, the rights of kings always asserted, and those of mankind never laid aside. The same spirit in which it is written gave me the confidence to offer it to the virtuous consort of a king who, among so many crowned heads, enjoys almost alone the inestimable honour of ruling a free nation, a king who makes his power consist in being beloved and his glory in being just. Our Descartes, who was the greatest philosopher in Europe before Sir Isaac Newton appeared, dedicated the principles to the celebrated Princess Palatine Elizabeth. Not, said he, because she was a princess, for true philosophers respect princes and never flatter them, but because of all his readers she understood him the best and loved truth the most. I beg leave, madam, without comparing myself to Descartes, to dedicate La Henriade to your majesty upon the like account, and not only as the protectress of all arts and sciences, but as the best judge of them. I am with that profound respect which is due to the greatest virtue as well as the highest rank. May it please your majesty's most humble, most dutiful, and most obliged servant, Voltaire. Even if we allow for flattery, and Voltaire was not given to flattering princes, this dedication is a remarkable tribute to Caroline's mental powers and her interest in the arts. Voltaire must have known of her friendship with Sir Isaac Newton. He had probably heard of her admiration for Queen Elizabeth, and he skilfully wove allusions to both in his dedication. The first edition of La Henriade was sold to subscribers at 1 guinea a copy, and had a great success. The Queen herself solicited subscriptions for it among her friends, and the edition was soon exhausted. Nor did her interest stop here. She persuaded the king to give Voltaire a present of 2,000 crowns, equal to £500, and she added to this a further present of £200 from her privy purse, and sent Voltaire her portrait. English men of letters were not so fortunate as Voltaire in winning the favour of the court. When she was Princess of Wales, Caroline made welcome any literary man of eminence to Leicester House, whatever his creed or party, Papist or Arian, Jacobite, Whig or Tory. George I's contempt for literature made her graciousness the more marked, and perhaps it was her affability and eagerness to please that gave rise to expectations which were later unfulfilled. For it is certain that many eminent writers of prose and verse expected great things when Caroline became queen, and it is equally certain that they were grievously disappointed. Whether with all the goodwill in the world and all the power the queen could have satisfied every one of them may be doubted, for the literary mind is not prone to underrate its merits. As events turned out, she could do little or nothing for any man of letters, unless he were eligible for preferment in the church. She found herself as queen in a position of less freedom and greater responsibility. She was as anxious as ever to befriend literary men, but in this respect she found herself thwarted by the king and opposed by Walpole. Her difficulties, too, were increased by the fact that nearly every writer of talent was either openly or secretly hostile to the government. For this hostility Walpole was to blame. He had inaugurated a new policy. During the reign of William and Anne, and even in the reign of George I, while Townshend and Stanhope were prime ministers, literary men were courted and caressed by those in authority. In short, it has been well said that, though the sovereign was never an Augustus, every minister was a Maecenas. Lucrative places were found for many writers in departments of the civil service, and others were aided to enter Parliament or diplomacy. But when Walpole became Prime Minister in 1721, he changed all this and set his face like a flint against employing literary men in the public service in any capacity whatsoever. In this he was supported by George I and his successor George II, who both despised literature and never opened a book. The number of readers was far more limited then than now, though perhaps they were more discriminating, and writing books was consequently less lucrative. When men of talent and genius saw the avenues of patronage and of usefulness in the state suddenly closed to them by the Prime Minister, it is no wonder that they placed their pens at the service of the opposition, led as it was by two men so appreciative of the claims of literature as Bolingbroke and Pulteney. But Walpole did not heed, and for 20 years followed the same policy. "No writer need apply" was written over every door that led to preferment in the state, but in the long run the writers had their revenge, and his neglect of the pamphleteers was one of the chief causes that led to Walpole's fall. Queen Caroline had promised so fair when Princess of Wales, and her influence over her husband was known to be so great that many literary men looked forward to her coming to the throne as likely to bring about a revival of the Augustan age of Queen Anne. They were bitterly disappointed when they found her in close accord with the minister who had slammed the door of patronage in their faces, and many considered that she had betrayed them. They forgot that in an alliance like that between the Queen and Walpole, each had to yield something, and the Queen yielded some of her interest in letters for the larger interest she had at stake. It was a pity that with so real a desire to help literature, Caroline was able to do so little. It was a still greater pity that after she became queen, her relations with some of the greatest English men of letters, like Swift, Gay, and Pope, were strained to breaking point. The fault was not all on her side, and in some cases the breach was inevitable, but it was none the less unfortunate. Swift, who had fallen with Bolingbroke in 1714, visited England in 1726 for the first time since the death of Queen Anne, probably with the object of effecting a reconciliation with the reigning dynasty. He made the acquaintance of Mrs. Howard through his friends Pope and Gay, and was introduced by her to Caroline, then Princess of Wales. Writing years later to the Duchess of Queensberry, who hated Caroline, Swift declared that a nameless person, the Queen, sent me 11 messages before I would yield her a visit. This was surely an exaggeration, and it was written at a time when Swift, having lost all hope of preferment from the Queen, was paying his court to the Duchess. Swift, no doubt, was quite as ready to have an audience as Caroline was to grant him one. He began the conversation by saying that he knew the princess loved to see odd persons, and having seen a wild boy from Germany, he supposed she now had a curiosity to see a wild dean from Ireland. Caroline laughed, and found in his genius an excuse for the lack of courtly manners. He came several times to Leicester House. Swift returned to Ireland well pleased with his reception, though no definite promise of what he desired, English preferment, had been given him. He came again to England early the following year, 1727, as it proved for the last time. His coming was heralded by the publication of his famous satire, Gulliver's Travels. Caroline read the book with delight, and when the author presented himself at Leicester House, welcomed him most graciously. She accepted from him a present of Irish poplins, and promised him a medallion of herself in return. Swift was also a constant and welcome guest in the apartments of Mrs. Howard, and met there, besides many men of letters, politicians of the stamp of Townshend and Compton. He was in England at the time of George I's death, and kissed the hands of the new king and queen. For a time he was full of hope, but his expectations received a shock when he found Walpole, Bob the poet's foe, confirmed in power. He went back to Ireland, cast down but not dismayed, and waited there for the summons that never came. For some time the Dean placed faith in Mrs. Howard, and more especially in the Queen's graciousness. He knew also the Queen's view on church matters, and his unorthodoxy, which had hindered Anne from making him a bishop, would, he thought, be a point in his favour with Caroline. His commanding literary abilities ought certainly to have given him a strong claim upon her consideration, but Swift, the friend of Bolingbroke, was disliked by Walpole, and Caroline distrusted every one who was intimate with Bolingbroke. Moreover, Swift thought, like so many others, that the way to the king's favour lay through his mistress rather than his wife, and on both his visits to England he paid great court to Mrs. Howard, visiting her frequently, flattering her, telling her some of his best stories, and writing her some of his wittiest letters. Caroline, who knew of this friendship, resented it, and though she gave the great Dean audience and was affable to him as she was to everyone, she made a mental note against his name, and never helped him to realize his wish of obtaining English preferment. She had never promised to give it to him, but she had promised to send him her medallion. Swift, who for some time after his return to Ireland kept up a correspondence with Mrs. Howard, wrote to her recalling the Queen's promise. "First, therefore," he writes, "I call you to witness that I did not attend on the Queen until I had received her repeated messages, which of course occasioned my being introduced to you. I never asked anything till, upon leaving England for the first time, I desired from you a present worth a guinea, and from Her Majesty one worth £10, by way of a memorial. Yours I received, and the Queen, upon taking my leave of her, made an excuse that she had intended a medal for me, which not being ready, she would send it to me the Christmas following. Yet this was never done, nor at all remembered when I went back to England the next year, and attended her as I have done before. I must now tell you, madam, that I will receive no medal from Her Majesty, nor anything less than her picture at half length, drawn by Jervis, and if he takes it from another original, the Queen shall at least sit twice for him to touch it up. I desire you will let Her Majesty know this in plain words, although I have heard I am under her displeasure. Against you I have but one reproach, that when I was last in England, and just after the present king's accession, I resolved to pass that summer in France, for which I had then a most lucky opportunity, from which those who seemed to love me well dissuaded me by your advice. And when I sent you a note conjuring you to lay aside the character of a courtier and a favourite upon that occasion, your answer positively directed me not to go at that juncture, and you said the same thing to my friends, who seemed to have power of giving me hints that I might reasonably have expected a settlement in England, which, God knows, is no great ambition, considering the station I should leave here, of greater dignity, which might easily have been managed to be disposed of as the Crown pleased. I wish Her Majesty would a little remember what I largely said to her about Ireland, when before a witness she gave me leave, and commanded me to tell here what she spoke to me upon that subject, and ordered me, if I lived to see her in her present station, to send her our grievances, promising to read my letter, and do all good offices in her power for this most miserable and most loyal kingdom, now at the brink of ruin, and never so near as now. As to myself, I repeat again that I have asked nothing more than a trifle as a memorial of some distinction, which Her Majesty graciously seemed to make between me and every common clergyman. That trifle was forgot, according to the usual method of princes, although I was taught to think myself upon a footing of obtaining some little exception. Whether Mrs. Howard laid this letter before the Queen, as the Dean evidently intended her to do, or spoke to the Queen on the subject, is not known. In any case, Swift would have done better to have written directly to the Queen herself, or if that were impossible, to have chosen some more congenial channel of communication than Mrs. Howard. The Queen was jealous of her influence, and Mrs. Clayton, who disliked Swift, had been taught to think that ecclesiastical recommendations were especially within her province. For Mrs. Howard to have asked the Queen for the meanest curacy for one of her favourites would have been resented. So it came about that after Swift had waited a few years longer, heart sick with deferred hope, he turned on Mrs. Howard as well as her mistress, though in the former case he was not only ungrateful but unjust, for the poor lady had not the power, though she had the will, to help him. But Swift in his Irish exile could not be expected to know the true inwardness of affairs at court. As for Mrs. Howard and her mistress, he wrote, I have nothing to say but that they have neither memory nor manners, else I should have had some mark of the former from the latter, which I was promised about 2 years ago, but since I made them a present, it would be mean to remind them. He was extremely sensitive to slights, and he resented the Queen's forgetfulness about the medal almost as much as the fact that she omitted him from her list of preferments. Years after, in a poem which he wrote on his own death, the old grievance of the medals crops up again. From Dublin soon to London spread, 'tis told at court, the Dean is dead, and Lady Suffolk in the spleen runs laughing up to tell the Queen. The Queen, so gracious, mild, and good, cries, Is he gone? 'Tis time he should. He's dead, you say, then let him rot. I am glad the medals were forgot. I promised him, I own, but when? I only was the princess then, and now the consort of a king. You know, 'tis quite another thing. Swift never forgave the Queen's neglect, and for years until her death, Caroline was the subject of his sharpest satirical attacks. But his satire failed to move her any more than his presence and compliments had done. The great Dean was left to drag out the remainder of his days in Ireland, embittered by disappointment and darkened by despair. Probably Walpole intersposed his veto also. It was felt that such a firebrand was safer in Ireland, and his presence in England might seriously embarrass the government. No doubt there was something to be said from that point of view, but the way in which those in authority neglected this great genius, until baffled ambition drove him to drink and madness, will ever remain one of the most tragic pages in the history of literature. Gay, like Swift, also had a grievance against the Queen, though if Swift had any reason on his side, Gay certainly had none. Caroline had frequently showed him kindness when Princess of Wales, and had promised to help him when it was in her power. This promise she redeemed within a few weeks of the King's accession. She laughingly told Mrs. Howard that she would now take up the hare with many friends, an allusion to one of Gay's fables, and she offered him the post of gentleman usher to the little Princess Louisa, a sinecure with a salary of £200 a year, which would be equivalent to £400 in the present day. There was little else that the Queen could offer him. The public service was now closed to writers, and as Gay was not in holy orders, he could not be provided for in the church. This appointment, she thought, would secure him from want and give him leisure for his pen. But Gay, whose head was quite turned by the adulation of foolish women, not only refused the Queen's offer, but resented it as an insult. Soon after, he was taken up by the Duke and Duchess of Queensberry, who were among his kindest friends. The Duchess of Queensberry was one of the most beautiful and graceful women of her day. She was a daughter of Lord Clarendon, and therefore cousin of the late Queen Anne. She was of a haughty disposition, and considered herself quite equal, if not superior, to the princes of the House of Hanover. The fact that Gay had been slighted, as he considered, by Queen Caroline, was enough to make her champion his cause more warmly. Gay soon declared war against the court and the government in his famous Beggar's Opera, which teemed with topical allusions and covert political satire. The character of Bob Booty, for instance, was understood to be Sir Robert Walpole, and was especially a butt for ridicule. The Beggar's Opera took the town by storm. It enjoyed not only an unprecedented run in London, but was played in all the great towns of England, Ireland, and Scotland. It became a fashionable craze. Ladies sang the favourite songs, and carried about fans depicting incidents and characters in the piece. Pictures of the actress Miss Fenton, who played the leading part, were sold by the thousand, and songs and verses were composed in her honour. She became a popular toast and a reigning beauty, and finally married the Duke of Bolton, who ran away with her. But the Queen and Walpole resented the covert sarcasm in the play, and when Gay, encouraged by the success of the Beggar's Opera, wrote a sequel called Polly and had it ready for rehearsal, the Duke of Grafton, Lord Chamberlain, acting under the orders of the King, who was instigated by the Queen, refused to license the performance. It was said that Walpole was satirized in Polly under a thin disguise as a highwayman, but whatever the reason, the prohibition of the play only made it more popular. If it could not be played, it could be read, and every one who had a grudge against Walpole or the court bought it when it came out in book form. The Duchess of Marlborough gave £100 for a single copy, and the Duchess of Queensberry solicited subscriptions for it within the very precincts of St. James's, and at a drawing-room went round the room and asked even the officers of the King's household to buy copies of the play which the King had forbidden to be played. The King caught her in the act and asked what she was doing. She replied, "What must be agreeable, I am sure, to one so humane as your Majesty, for I am busy with an act of charity, and a charity to which I do not despair of bringing your Majesty to contribute." The King guessed what the charity was, and talked the incident over with the Queen, who so resented the Duchess's action, which she rightly guessed was aimed more particularly at herself, that the King's Vice-Chamberlain was sent to request her not to appear at court again. The Vice-Chamberlain's message was verbal, but the Duchess immediately wrote a spirited reply. The Duchess of Queensberry is surprised and well pleased that the King hath given her so agreeable a command as to stay from court, where she never came for diversion, but to bestow a great civility on the King and Queen. She hopes that by such an unprecedented order as this is, that the King will see as few as he wishes at his court, particularly such as dare to think or speak truth. I dare not do otherwise, and ought not, nor could have imagined that it would not have been the very highest compliment that I could possibly pay the King, to endeavour to support truth and innocence in his house, particularly when the King and Queen both told me that they had not read Mr. Gay's play. I have certainly done right then to stand by my own words rather than his Grace of Grafton's, who hath neither made use of truth, judgment, nor honour through this whole affair, either for himself or his friends. The Duchess told the Vice-Chamberlain to take the letter to the King at once. The Vice-Chamberlain read it, and thought it so disrespectful that he begged her to reconsider the matter. Thereupon she sat down and wrote a second letter, which was even worse, so he took the first after all. The king was beside himself with passion when he received it, and uttered the most appalling threats. But the Duchess went about unharmed, and laughed him to scorn. She was glad to have this opportunity of showing her contempt for the German court, as she called it, and her husband supported her action by resigning his office of Vice-Admiral of Scotland. Poor Mrs. Howard was the only sufferer, for Gay and the Duchess were both her friends, and she therefore got the full brunt of the king's ill temper. Most people took the Duchess's part, thinking that the court had been impolitic in noticing her action on behalf of Gay, who became, for the moment, a popular martyr. "He has got several turned out of their places," wrote Arbuthnot to Swift, "the greatest ornament of the court banished from it for his sake, and another great lady, Mrs. Howard, in danger of being chassée likewise, about 7 or 8 duchesses pushing forward like the ancient circumceliones in the church to see who shall suffer martyrdom on his account first. He is the darling of the city." Gay certainly did not suffer from the Lord Chamberlain's action, for the subscriptions to Polly brought him in £1,200, whereas by the Beggar's Opera, with all its success, he had only gained £400. Therefore, as Dr. Johnson says, what he called oppression ended in profit. The Queen's difference with Pope arose out of the political exigencies of the hour. Unlike Swift and Gay, he expected nothing from her, and had therefore no disappointment. As a Roman Catholic, he was debarred from all places of honour and emolument, though in the reign of George I, Secretary Craggs offered him a pension of £300 a year, to be paid from the Secret Service money. Pope had been a familiar figure at Leicester House and Richmond Lodge. He was a great friend of Mrs. Howard, and a favourite with the maids of honour. Caroline, as Princess of Wales, had shown him many courtesies, and recognised his genius and admired his work. But Pope's friendship with Bolingbroke and hatred of Walpole necessarily led to a breach between himself and the Queen. As Mrs. Howard's influence waned and Walpole's became greater, Pope came no more to court, and had nothing for the Queen but sneers and ridicule. His famous quarrel with Lord Hervey also did much to widen the breach, for the Queen naturally took her favourite side. A friend of Lord Hervey's in the House of Commons spoke of Pope as a lampooner who scattered his ink without fear or decency. This was true of both combatants, who showed in a most unamiable light in this sordid quarrel. The origin of the feud is involved in obscurity, but Lady Mary Wortley Montagu was undoubtedly in part responsible for it. Lady Mary, since her return from Constantinople in 1718, had occupied a unique position in society. She was a chartered libertine. Her conversation grew broader with advancing years, and her wit had more licence. Between her and Lord Hervey there existed one of those curious friendships which may sometimes be witnessed between an effeminate man and a masculine woman, and there seems no doubt that it was of the kind which is known as Platonic, for after Lord Hervey's death, when his eldest son sealed up and sent Lady Mary the letters she had written to his father, assuring her that he had not looked at them, she wrote to say that she almost regretted he had not, as it would have proved to him what most young men disbelieved, the possibility of a long and steady friendship subsisting between two persons of different sexes, without the least mixture of love. Lady Mary took a house at Twickenham, not far from Pope's beautiful villa, and though she was warned not to have anything to do with the wicked wasp of Twickenham, she renewed her friendship with the poet, and became as intimate with him as before. "Leave him as soon as you can," wrote Addison to her. "He will certainly play you some devilish trick else." But Lady Mary took no heed. Perhaps the danger of the experiment tempted her, and she fooled the little poet to the top of his bent. Pope, with all his genius, had an undue reverence for rank. He was flattered by the notice which this clever woman extended to him, and he genuinely admired her wit and vivacity. Lady Mary's house was the rendezvous of many of the courtiers and wits of the day, and here Pope often met Lord Hervey. Lady Mary delighted in the homage the poet gave to her ungrudgingly. It flattered her vanity that such a genius should be at her feet. She wrote to him effusive letters, and in one of them declared that he had discovered the philosopher's stone. "Since, by making the Iliad pass through your poetical grasp into an English form, without losing aught of its original beauty, you have drawn the golden current from Patroclus to Twickenham." Pope also wrote her the most extravagant epistles. In one referring to her portrait, which had been painted by Sir Godfrey Kneller, he says, "This picture dwells really at my heart, and I made a perfect passion of preferring your present face to your past." Again he tells her, "I write as if I were drunk. The pleasure I take in thinking of your return transports me beyond the bounds of common decency." After a time, Lady Mary began to grow rather weary of her poet, but he, on the contrary, became even more arduous, and was at last led into making her a passionate declaration of love. She received it by laughing in his face. Pope was keenly sensitive to ridicule. His deformity made him more so than most men. He was of a highly strung disposition, and Lady Mary's outburst of hilarity was a thing he could neither forget nor forgive. He withdrew deeply mortified and offended. His vanity could not understand how the beautiful Lady Mary could reject him with such disdain if another had not stolen her from him. He formed the idea that Lord Hervey was his rival, and against him therefore directed all his malice, spleen, and hatred. A scurrilous paper war began. Lord Hervey dabbled in poetry, not of great merit, and Pope savagely attacked it. Speaking of one of his own satires, against which he pretended a charge of weakness had been brought, he says, "The lines are weak, another's pleased to say, Lord Fanny spins 1,000 such a day." And again, "Like gentle Fanny's was my flowery theme, a painted mistress or a purling stream." Hervey, who thought his namby-pamby verses really poetry, was stung to the quick by this contemptuous allusion, and smarting under the satire, was foolish enough to retaliate upon Pope in a poor effusion addressed to the imitator of the satires of the second book of Horace. It runs, "Thus whilst with coward hand you stab and aim, and try at least to assassinate our fame, like the first bold assassins be thy lot, and ne'er be thy guilt forgiven or forgot. But as thou hast be hated by mankind, and with the emblem of thy crooked mind marked on thy back, like Cain by God's own hand, wander like him accursed through the land." In the same poem, Pope was told, "None thy crabbed numbers can endure, hard as thy heart, and as thy birth obscure." This brutal allusion to Pope's physical infirmities and his birth stung the most sensitive of poets to the quick. In this duel of wits, Hervey had chosen verse as his weapon, forgetting that in this line his adversary had no equal, and Pope seized the advantage. Hervey had set him an unworthy example, which he did not hesitate to follow, and he raked up everything which approached physical hideousness, weakness, or deformity in the person and mind of his adversary. According to Lord Hales, Lord Hervey, having felt some attack of epilepsy, entered upon and persisted in a very strict regimen, and thus stopped the progress and prevented the effects of that dreadful disease. His daily food was a small quantity of ass's milk and a flour biscuit. Once a week he indulged himself with eating an apple. He used emetics daily. Lord Hervey used paint to soften his ghastly appearance. All these weaknesses were seized upon by Pope and put into a poem wherein Lord Hervey was satirized as Sporus. Let Sporus tremble, what that thing of silk, Sporus, that mere white curd of ass's milk. Satire or sense, alas, can Sporus feel? Who breaks a butterfly upon a wheel? Yet let me flap this bug with gilded wings, this painted child of dirt that stinks and stings, whose buzz the witty and the fair annoys, yet wit ne'er tastes and beauty ne'er enjoys. So well-bred spaniels civilly delight in mumbling of the game they dare not bite. Eternal smiles his emptiness betray, as shallow streams run dimpling all the way, whether in florid impotence he speaks, and, as the prompter breathes, the puppet squeaks, or at the ear of Eve, familiar toad, half froth, half venom, spits himself abroad, in puns or politics, in tales or lies, or spite or smut, or rhymes or blasphemies, his wit all seesaw between that and this, now high, now low, now master up, now miss, and he himself one vile antithesis, amphibious thing, that acting either part, the trifling head or the corrupted heart. Fop at the toilet, flatterer at the board, now trips a lady, and now struts a lord. Eve's tempter thus the rabbins have expressed, a cherub's face and reptile all the rest. Beauty that shocks you, parts that none will trust, wit that can creep, and pride that licks the dust. Cox, alluding to the portrait of Sporus, writes, I never could read this passage without disgust and horror. Disgust at the indelicacy of the allusions, horror at the malignity of the poet in laying the foundation of his abuse on the lowest species of satire, personal invective, and what is still worse, sickness and debility. This condemnation is true of Pope's verses on Hervey, but it is equally true of Hervey's verses on Pope, and it was Hervey who began the personal abuse. Lady Mary did not escape either. Pope depicted her as a wanton, scoffed at her eccentricities, and hinted that she conferred her favours on a black man, the Sultan Ahmed of Turkey. Pope also addressed a prose letter to Lord Hervey, which was, if possible, more bitter and vindictive than his character of Sporus. He thought very highly of his letter, which Warton styles a masterpiece of invective. To one of his friends, Pope wrote, There is a woman's war declared against me by a certain lord. His weapons are the same which women and children use, a pin to scratch and a squirt to bespatter. I writ a sort of answer, but was ashamed to enter the lists with him, and after showing it some people, suppressed it, otherwise it was such as was worthy of him, and worthy of me. The reason Pope gives for suppressing this letter, which was not published until after his death, though privately shown to many, was not the true one. Queen Caroline got hold of a copy of the epistle, and it was at her express desire that Pope withheld it. She feared lest it should render her favourite contemptible in the eyes of the world, and though she was greatly incensed against Pope, she dissembled her anger and used her influence to end this wordy war, in which there could be no doubt that Pope was the victor. But though Caroline was unfortunate in her relations with Swift, Gay, and Pope, men whose writings shed a lustre on her era, she was the means of helping other writers who were eminent in a different way. Butler, the author of The Analogy, and Berkeley, who wrote The Minute Philosopher, she preferred to high office in the church. For other writers who were not in holy orders, she did what she could. She befriended Steele at a time when, to use his own words, he was bereft both of limbs and speech. She had often befriended him before in the course of his checkered career. She reprieved Savage, the natural son of that unnatural mother, the Countess of Macclesfield, when he lay under sentence of death. And after his wonderful poem The Bastard was written, she helped him again with a pension of £50 from her privy purse. She patronised Somerville, author of The Chase, no mean poet in the opinion of Dr. Johnson, and she sought to support that luckless playwright, William Duncombe. It was one of her sayings that genius was superior to the patronage of princes, but she had a great sympathy for literary endeavour, however humble. But the patronage of minor writers was more often dictated by the kindness of her heart than by the soundness of her judgment. An instance of this was afforded by her patronage of Stephen Duck, whose fate had been not aptly compared to that of Burns, without the genius. Stephen Duck was the son of a peasant in Wiltshire and worked as a day labourer and thresher on a farm at Charlton. He must have had some ability and a good deal of application, for when his day's work was done, he taught himself the rudiments of grammar and a smattering of history and science. These labours bore fruit in poetry, but the poems remained unpublished until Duck reached the age of 30, when he had the good fortune to attract the notice of a country clergyman named Spence, who not only lent him books, but found the means for him to print some of his poems in pamphlet form, including The Thresher's Labour, a poem descriptive of his own life, and The Shunammite. These poems found their way into the hands of Lord Tankerville and Dr. Alured Clarke, prebendary of Winchester, who thought so highly of their merits that they got up a subscription to aid the author. Dr. Alured Clarke did more. He wrote to his friend Mrs. Clayton, telling her the story of Duck's life and begging her to bring his poems before the notice of the Queen. By this time Duck had quite a coterie of admirers in his own county, who, as Dr. Alured Clarke wrote, thought the thresher, with all his defects, a superior genius to Mr. Pope. Caroline was much interested in the fact that these poems were written by a poor thresher, and when the court was at Windsor, she commanded that Duck should be brought there. She was so pleased with his manner and address that she settled a small annual pension on him, and in 1733 made him one of the yeomen of the guard. Dr. Alured Clarke, by this time one of the royal chaplains, and Mrs. Clayton acted as the sponsors of the poet, whose work now became well known. The most extravagant ideas were formed concerning it, some considering The Thresher's Labour superior to Thomson's Seasons, and others declaring that the author of The Shunammite was the greatest poet of the age. Thus encouraged, Duck wrote more poems, and the Queen's patronage secured for them a large sale. Naturally, many were in praise of this generous benefactress. Duck in due time took holy orders, to which he had always a leaning. He was ordained as a literate by the Bishop of Salisbury. Shortly after his ordination, the Queen appointed him keeper of Merlin's Cave, a fanciful building she had erected at Richmond. Both Merlin's Cave and Duck came in for a great deal of satire from the epigrammatic Masonaces, as Dr. Alured Clarke calls them, who regarded both the cave and the patronage of the poet as proofs of the Queen's folly rather than her wisdom. Pope wrote, "Lord, how we strut through Merlin's cave to see, no poets there but Stephen, you and me." Swift, writhing under neglect, penned a very caustic epigram. The thresher duck could o'er the queen prevail. The proverb says, no fence against a flail. From threshing corn he turns to thresh his brains, for which her majesty allows him grains. Though 'tis confessed that those who ever saw his poems think them all not worth a straw. Thrice happy duck, employed in threshing stubble, thy toils were lessened, and thy profits doubled. Close by Merlin's cave the queen raised another quaint conceit, known as the Hermitage, in which she placed busts of Adam Clarke, Newton, Locke, and other dead philosophers. These busts excited the ire of living worthies. Swift in his elegant extracts wrote, Lewis the living genius fed, and raised the scientific head. Our queen, more frugal of her meat, raises those heads that cannot eat. This drew forth the following repartee, addressed to Swift. Since Anna, whom bounty thy merits had fed, ere her own was laid low, had exalted your head. And since our good queen to the wise is so just, to raise heads from such as are humbled in dust, I wonder, good man, that you are not involted. Pray thee go and be dead, and be doubly exalted. Whereto the Dean wittily replied, Her Majesty never shall be my exalter, and yet she would raise me, I know, by a halter. Stephen Duck's poetry was popular in its day, but it owed its popularity to the favour of the Queen rather than to its intrinsic merit. His talent was not sufficient to overcome the defects of his early education. Duck realized this far more than his friends, and he was keenly sensitive to the satire which great writers like Swift and Pope thought it worth their while to pour upon him. The Queen remained his constant friend, and preferred him successively to a chaplaincy at Kew and the rectory of Byfleet in Surrey. But Duck was not a happy man. His education began too late in life, and he could never accommodate himself to his altered circumstances. He ended his career by committing suicide a few years after the death of his patroness. End of section 7.